Hello everyone, welcome to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. Today we are here to discuss the news analysis for 20th of March 2024. Now before we begin with our analysis, a very important announcement for all of you, and this is something that has been published on the UPSC website as of yesterday. Rescheduling of Civil Services Prelims and Indian Forest Service Prelims Examination 2024. So what's happened is that there is a postponement of the examination which was supposed to happen on 26th of May 2024. Now it is supposed to happen on 16th of June 2024. So this is a postponement that has been done due to the general election dates that have been recently come up. So that is the basic reason why there is a postponement by 3 weeks that we see here. Now one thing for all of you, this postponement means nothing. Please don't think of these 3 extra weeks at all. These are just 3 weeks and not 3 years. So please don't become relaxed and please don't start going here and there and being relaxed in your preparation. If you are preparing for 2024 examination, the date change by 3 weeks should mean nothing for you. Keep thinking of 26th of May. Prepare everything according to 26th of May and then relish those 3 extra weeks so that you can revise more, you can do more, you can practice more in those 3 weeks. But right now your focus still should be in accordance with all the plans that you had for 26th of May. So please don't do any kind of think of these postponements and don't be relaxed for the next few days thinking that now we have 21 extra days. Please don't do that. All right. So that's why just a reminder for everyone that this is a new notification. Now before we begin, also there is this scholarship test that we are going to conduct for you, and this is happening on 24th of March at 11 a.m. The registrations are now open and you can register till 6 a.m. in the morning on 24th of March. So please do attend this scholarship test if you are somebody who are preparing for the next year's examination or years after that. Now let's come to the discussion of all the articles that we have in today's newspaper. Now today we have a lot of articles which are pretty important. There are a total of 12 articles that we have, out of which there are 4 articles that we are going to do a detailed analysis. So first is the curious case of Sosamma Iype and the Vechur cow. So what is Vechur cow and who is Dr. Sosamma Iype? Will try to understand that and we'll discuss that. This is on the editorial page, an article written by Shashi Tharoor. A very, very good article, wonderful article to read. Ties that epitomize India's neighborhood first policy. This is on India-Bhutan relations, something that we have been discussing for the past 1 week, where we see that now India-Bhutan, there are some updates and we'll discuss that. Then guaranteed MSP is an ethical imperative. Again, something which is related to the farmer protests and one aspect of MSP that has been brought forward by the author. Again, it is on the editorial page. And then changing cancer nomenclature can improve treatment outcomes. So this is one article published on the science page and we'll discuss about the various aspects of what it has been discussing. Then there are 4 articles from prelims perspective. One, a report on the state of global climate that says that 2023 was the hottest year. Then Supreme Court directs states to give ration cards to 8 crore workers, and we'll discuss about e-Shram in this context. What is e-Shram portal? Then 27.6 million people engaged in forced labor in 2021. This is an ILO report that has come up. We'll discuss the details of that report. Food prices deterring inflation's fall. So we'll discuss about what's happening with food prices and how it is affecting the inflation. And then there are 4 articles that are just, you can say, updates on something that we have been discussing for a while. For example, yesterday we saw that the cases were brought to the Supreme Court in regard to CAA, and this is an update on already going on discussions. Similarly, another article that we have discussed quite a few times with regard to what's happening with Patanjali and the advertisements case in Patanjali perspective. Then another update on Israel-Gaza issue, where we see that UN has said that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. And then finally, again, EFTA, something we have been discussing, and how Norway is also going to invest big. So these are the articles that we are going to discuss. Coming to the first article, and this is an article on page number 6, the curious case of Sosamma Iype and Vechur cow. Now, this is an article that has been published here, and this is an article that has been written by Shashi Tharoor. A very, very good article and a case study, you can say, in a manner, when we look at India's biodiversity and the importance of all the indigenous species that we have in India. Now, overall, when it comes to this article, this article says, and let's also understand the highlights of this article, because this article is talking about Dr. Sosamma Iype and her contribution in the context of saving and preserving India's indigenous varieties or indigenous species of cows. Now, not only cows, rather every livestock species. So she also was awarded with Padma Shri in 2022, and that is what it highlights. And let's look at this case study altogether. What is it trying to highlight? Now, when we look at the article highlights, first it talks about what happened post-independence. That in post-independence India, we see that there are very severe poverty and food scarcity that we were looking at. And this is something that also led to, because with a population that was very largely dependent on agriculture and animal husbandry, there was a pressing need for India to also start modernizing these sectors. And this is something that led to establishment of agricultural universities and the initiatives in these particular areas, where we look at revolutions like green and white revolutions that happen in this particular scenario. So that's why we see that establishment of agricultural universities happen, green revolution, white revolution, etc. happen. This is where we are trying to increase our productivity with regard to agriculture and the dairy industries. Now, despite the successes of these revolutions in boosting the production, what we have seen is that they actually also had a lot of negative impact on the indigenous breeds of livestock. For example, the context that has been taken in this has been of the Vechur cow. Now, Vechur is a small village in Kerala, and this is where the name for this cow has been given from. And this is one of the world's smallest cattle breeds, and this is a breed that became nearly extinct due to the preference given to the high yielding foreign breeds. And this is where we see that Dr. Sosamma's connection to the Vechur cow comes to the highlight, where we see that she was the one who realized that this breed almost is disappearing, and she is somebody who had grown consuming the milk of this particular species of cow. And by 1989, she says that while teaching at one of the veterinary colleges, she realized that this breed almost had disappeared, and even the official records, it was being considered almost as extinct. So this is what also brought this to her notice, and she started working on this aspect. And a turning point in this regard came when one of her students named Anil Zakaria comes forward and discovers a Vechur cow in Kerala. Now this discovery reignited her hope and commitment to saving of this particular breed. Now overall, when we look at this aspect, this is where we understand that this led to further establishment of something called as the Vechur Conservation Unit. So she founded the Vechur Conservation Unit in Kerala Agricultural University, and this is where we had just 8 cows initially. And then further we see that this initiative rapidly starts to expand, and this demonstrates her dedication altogether to the preservation of all the indigenous cattle breeds. Now, apart from that, we do see that there were challenges and there were oppositions that were also faced. For example, there was skepticism from the government officials, and many of the colleagues also going against. There were false accusations from some of the environmentalists as well, and somewhere some hostile media coverage also happened in this particular regard. But good thing was that she persisted with her efforts. She did not back out, and this is where we look at a national recognition and support that now she starts to gain. The success that we see, the success of the Vechur conservation project eventually gained recognition beyond Kerala, and this is where we see that national institutes like Indian Council of Agricultural University, agricultural research also starts to recognize these areas and starts to adopt these models so that it can act as a conservation model all across the country. And this is where we see that she starts to uh, also have a better impact altogether on the conservation activities in India, where we see that she also founded the trust. Now this trust was to promote the communities which participate and support in the destitute farmers by providing them with the Vechur cattle. And that's why this work has not only preserved a very unique indigenous breed, but has also empowered many of the families that are living in these kind of areas. And overall, we see that overall, rather than seeking personal glory, she started focusing on contributing to the society and making a tangible difference here. And that's why her efforts become very, very important in this particular regard, because they will now have lasting impact on India's cultural and agricultural heritage as well. And overall, it will also solidify her status as, you can say, a true heroine in the act of biodiversity conservation. So that's why this entire story, it underscores the importance of balancing the industrial and agricultural modernization also with all the biodiversity conservation that is required. And that's why this entire story becomes a very powerful reminder of the impact that one individual can have on the entire preservation journey of the indigenous species. Now understand something, that when we are talking about these kind of stories, where are these stories important? In what sense are these stories important? And this is largely with regard to the importance of indigenous species. We need to realize that often you'll see that we have been also focusing on the best of the variants that we can bring in from rest of the world. We have seen the examples of cow varieties that have been brought from outside. But at the same time, focusing on the indigenous varieties is also very, very important, because this is where we actually can take a lot of steps in ensuring that local communities also get a support. So understand the various aspects of it, and this is where we have certain examples. I've taken certain examples from various parts of the country where in one way or the other we see that indigenous species have shown a very, very important aspect of how and why biodiversity conservation becomes crucial, especially of the indigenous varieties. First, their adaptation to the local environments. What we understand is that lot of indigenous species, they have evolved over centuries to adopt to a very specific local environment. And that's why when it comes to their adaptability, they are more resilient to all the local diseases and pests and all the climatic conditions, such as even droughts and flooding kind of situations, than all the exotic breeds that we bring in. And in this regard, this particular picture that you see right here on your screen is of Gir cow. Now, this was where, if you look at last year's news, there is a cloning also that has been done. Cloning of Gir cow was carried out in March, last March. So cloning of Gir cow was carried out in last March. And why Gir cow was actually chosen? And this Gir cow is basically something, is a variety or a variant species that comes from the regions of the Gir forest in Gujarat. And when it comes to these cows, they are known for their very high milk production, and they also have very exceptional heat tolerance as well. And that's why they are very well suited to India's tropical climate. And knowing all these things, what was suggested, what was done by India is that we did a cloning of this Gir cow last March, because this is where we now are taking steps towards cloning of indigenous varieties, basically to enhance milk production. This is where we are taking a step towards enhancing milk production because of the adaptability that these variants can show. Similarly, there have been other examples also. For example, let's say in the Kutch region, you have a camel called as the Kutchi camel. And the Kutchi camel also, these are very crucial for transportation and agriculture in the desert environments, because they are adapted to these kind of environments. So that's why they also can be taken as an example of how they are well adapted to the local environments. Similarly, when we look at other aspects of these things, they also are very important for biodiversity and genetic diversity as well, because indigenous breeds, they contribute very significantly to the biodiversity of any given ecosystem. They possess very unique genes and they can be very crucial for all the future breeding programs as well, which are very important for improving the resistance to diseases, adapting to the climate changes, and also enhancing the nutritional qualities of livestock products. So that's why they play very, very important in this particular role. And that is where, when we are talking about these varieties, we discussed about the Vechur cow in this particular case study as well, where we see that they are very well designed for disease resistance and have very high medicinal value in case of its milk as well. And similarly, we see that there are other variants as well. So for example, when we look at the case of this particular cow, which is called as the Kangayam cattle. So in the Kangayam cattle, the Kangayam cattle is actually found in the Tamil Nadu region, and that is where we see that this is also valued for its strength and agility in also traditional sports and also in agricultural work. So that's why they become very, very crucial in this particular context. So this is basically Kangayam cattle variant. So they, two aspects we see that: one, their agricultural use, and then also in traditional sports many a times also we see that they actually have been a very crucial part in this particular scenario. So that's why they actually also have been playing a good role, and they are known for their strength and agility, and that is why in these kind of efforts they are useful. Similarly, they can also, when it comes to indigenous varieties, they can also be important from the perspective of their produce, or how they can be important for milk production or egg production or meat production. So they are very unique in their nutritional and medicinal properties. For example, some of the indigenous cattle variants that we have, they produce milk which have higher levels of beneficial fatty acids or some of the other nutrients than some of the commercial breeds that we are breeding. So that's why in this context we have the Malnad Gid, and this also is very, very important breed which is found in the Western Ghats, and this is where they actually produce milk which have higher fat content, and that's why they are beneficial for making traditional dairy products as well. So that is the example that we have right here. They also become very crucial. So you have the Malnad Gidda, which is traditionally found in the Western Ghats area, and this is where we see that they actually have a quality that they give milk with high fats quantity, which is important for dairy products, right? So this is something that will help in making better dairy products. Then similarly, they also have cultural and historical significance as well. We see that there are various different species. For example, many of the indigenous livestock breeds, they are very deeply intertwined with the cultural identity and the traditions of the local communities. They have been a part of rituals and ceremonies and also maybe daily life of people living in these areas, and they contribute to the entire social fabric of these communities. And in this regard, there is the very famous example of the Pashmina goats. Indigenous to the very high altitudes of Jammu and Kashmir, these goats actually produce very fine wool, which is also used in world-renowned something called as Pashmina shawls, which are very integral to the local cultures and the economy of this particular area. So that's why the Pashmina goats, known for their very fine wool. So that's why they also become very, very crucial, and Pashmina shawl basically comes from here. Now, apart from that, we see that they are also required for economic sustainability for small holders as well. Now, this is a very, very crucial part of Indian agriculture especially, because the indigenous breeds are very often more suited to the low input mixed farming systems which are practiced by smallhold farmings in many parts of the country. And that's why these are the ones that will graze on marginal lands, and they would require less intensive care, and they also provide a source of income through the sale of products like milk or wool, etc. And that's why we see that they become very crucial. So for example, let's say you can take even Pashmina goat as an example here, but I have another example for you, and this is about the Sahiwal cows that are found in the Punjab region, and they are very important for the high milk yield that they have and the heat tolerance that also they provide. And that's why they provide steady income to all the small scale farmers who are there in this particular area. So that's why they also play a very important role. So we are talking about the Sahiwal cows. So they basically have high milk yield. So they also, that's why they play an important role. And then lastly, if we also look at another aspect which is very crucial, is the climate change resilience many a times that they have shown. Because with their genetic diversity and the adaptability, many of the indigenous breeds are very valuable assets in adapting to and also mitigating the efforts of climate change. And that's why they can be very crucial for maintaining the livestock production in areas which are increasingly affected by extreme weather conditions. In this regard, this again is a very important example of in the northeastern states of India, and this is where we are talking about Mithun. And Mithun is adapted to the hilly forested terrains and is also a very integral part of the socio-economic culture of the tribal communities, and that's why it showcases the resilience to the changing environmental conditions as well. So that's why this example of Mithun very often also has been in discussion in the northeastern parts of the country. So that's why these are some examples that we should understand with why their importance, where do we see their importance, and why do we have to look into their conservation efforts. Now coming to the second article, ties that epitomize India's neighborhood first policy. Now when it comes to this article has been discussing something which is an ongoing study altogether, you can say. Now in this we are talking about how exactly do we look at India and Bhutan relations. Now in the context of Bhutan-India relations, we have to understand that there are vast differences in the size population between India and Bhutan, yet we see that we have been maintaining very strong partnership over the past 50 years since our independence. There was a treaty that was signed in 1949, and this was a treaty of friendship, and once we signed this treaty, we have seen that there has been very good cooperation and mutual respect between India and Bhutan. So that's why we have seen that we see each other as equals, and that's why we have been treating each other with mutual respect, and that's very crucial. And then at the same time what we see is that this mutual regard becomes very crucial because it has allowed these two countries to look beyond the physical dimensions and foster a relationship between these two states which becomes very close. Similarly, we have seen that there have been cultural and economic respect that we have seen. For example, India always has respected Bhutan's unique identity and the religious practices. At the same time, all the aspirations that Bhutan has for its economic prosperity without sacrificing its way of life. And this is why, which is very crucial, because we have seen that Bhutan has been culturally a very good country which has adhered to its ways of culture, yet also looking at economic prosperity. And similarly, we have seen that Bhutan also trusts India, where we have seen that India has been supporting Bhutan in its growth, development, and various aspects of its prosperity without posing a threat to the sovereignty or identity of Bhutan. Then at the same time, what we have seen is that overall there has been trust and good relations in the leaderships as well. that overall the relationship has been characterized by a very unique level of trust among the leadership of both these countries. And this is also very evident in the recent high-level visits that have happened and the discussions which are aimed at some of the future and strengthening of the bilateral ties between India and Bhutan. That the head of the country from both the countries, from Bhutan, he visits India, and now our Prime Minister is also slated to visit Bhutan this week. So overall, that's why we need to understand where these are important when we are talking about the Gelefu project right now. We have seen that there has been a proposal from the King of Bhutan for a mindfulness city in Gelefu, and this is aimed at attracting foreign investments and also at the same time trying to prioritize the stability and well-being of the areas. And that's why we'll see that there will be they also expect significant participation from India as well. And that's why this project is also intended to enhance the Bhutanese income levels also, which address the environmental concerns also of these kind of areas. Similarly, we have seen that there have been recent high-level visits, and this exchange of visits between the prime ministers of both the countries and the discussions between these two countries, they are also going to nurture the bilateral relationships further, and they are also going to align with India's neighborhood first policy. And that is where we see that we have been cooperating with countries like Bhutan a lot. Similarly, when we look at the hydel power projects that we see here, these projects they become a cornerstone in a manner of India-Bhutan relations, where we see that there are several initiatives which are aimed at providing clean electricity to India and becomes a revenue source for Bhutan. And that's why overall we see that it's a very good exchange between these two countries. Similarly, we see that when we look at these visits, there is also a need for revisiting and possibly revising the joint ventures that we have for the models that we have proposed for hydropower projects, and so that we can also look at the future success of these kind of projects as well. So overall, that's why we see that there is a requirement that India's significant contribution that we see to even Bhutan's 12th five-year plan and the emphasis that we have on the projects, this will also benefit the Bhutanese people also. And that's why it overall will look towards the future of very strengthened ties between India and Bhutan. And that's why when we look towards the future, this is also very, very important to understand that we support the success of these kind of events or these kind of projects like the Gelefu Mindfulness City, where we have been talking about the measures that can help both the countries. For example, flights between both the countries leveraging Indian technology and the knowledge in infrastructure, promoting the visits by Indian tourists and business persons, and also encouraging Indian businesses to establish in Bhutan or in Gelefu. So that's why it is seen as beneficial not only for Bhutan but also for the socio-economic development for the adjacent areas in India also. So that is where all this is going, and in this context we have been discussing further, and with the visit of Prime Minister which is supposed to happen soon, we will see that there will be further discussions happening on this particular news. Now coming to the third article, which is on page number 7, guaranteed MSP is an ethical imperative. Now when it comes to this particular article, this is talking about one aspect of how these MSPs can be very, very crucial in the context of Indian agriculture and its growth. So there are few points that have been put by the author, and this is what this article basically talks about. So when we look at what's happening and what this article is saying, we have seen that the government has attempted to appease the farmers by offering them to procure pulses, maize and cotton at the MSP, but on conditions of crop diversification. Now this proposal was rejected by all the farm leaders, and that's why we see that they cited unaddressed core issues that they have, all these farmers have. Now in this regard, farmers have been calling for fair pricing of their produce for the legal assurance for MSPs, and this is where broadly we see that there are bigger challenges in food sufficiency and distribution that we need to address. So overall, when it comes to MSP becomes very crucial for ensuring food security by addressing the market failures that pave that basically prevent the farmers from influencing the pricing of their produce and ensuring that the prices remain above a critical threshold for them. But what we have seen is that despite all the MSP announcements for various different crops, the actual implementation has been lacking. And that's why it has been benefiting only a very small percentage of farmers. And this also contributes to economic unavailability, debt, and unfortunately a lot of farmer suicides in various parts of the country. Now, this is where the article argues that legal backing for MSP is supposed to be supported by various different. It has been supported by various different articles in the Indian Constitution as well. And when we look at the various aspects of what UN also has been talking about, so that's why it reflects a very widespread public and farmer support for such kind of measures. Now, overall, when it comes to the existing proposal for the legal frameworks for MSP, some of the states already have explored legal mechanisms to ensure MSP, where we have seen that some of the issues, for example, in case of sugar cane in Maharashtra, or proposed bills in the parliament and the state legislatures that we have seen in certain states, like even Andhra Pradesh. So there are all these things that we already see. But these efforts often also have faltered due to some of the political and strategic challenges as well that lie in the way of these legalities. So that's why there are all these things that have been mentioned in the article, and as a suggestion, as a solution that has been given by the author, he talks about amending state APMC acts, or also some of the states essential commodities acts. And in these kind of cases, what he also has been arguing is that it could legally ensure transactions above MSP. And overall, this may be along with support for crop planning and maybe a post harvest management at the same time, could also address the market failures without causing any kind of market distortion. So that's why these are the things that are being argued in the regard of this article. So that's why the crux of the views that have been expressed in this article, they are around the pressing need for establishing a legally guaranteed MSP for the farmers in India. And that's why it has been highlighted that how agrarian concerns, especially for the fair pricing and MSP, they have become central to the electoral discourse as well, and reflecting the agricultural communities' distress and the demand for systematic change altogether. And despite the efforts that are there from the side of the government, we see that the core issues still remain unaddressed, and this is something that is leading to widespread protest and calls for legal guarantees for MSP. So there are certain things that has been proposed as solutions. Just understand this. This is an important part of the entire discussion, where we are talking about the amendments in state APMC acts. Then at the same time, we also are talking about Centre's Essential Commodities Act. So even in the Essential Commodities Act, so amendment in Essential Commodities Act as well. And then apart from that, also help in crop planning, and post-harvest, in the same time also post-harvest management. So these are some of the possible solutions that we are talking of. So these kind of things, maybe it will address the market failures without causing any market distortion, is what has been argued in this article. Now, overall, what we also see is that increasing MSP to offer maybe a 50% profit margin over the total cost is also seen as being achievable, given the current margins just lie around somewhere around 20 to 22% as argued in the article. And this also would help in aiding in the procurement and distribution, also addressing some of the issues that are related to even hunger and malnutrition altogether. The article also talks about PM Asha scheme and the market intervention. That how exactly, when we talk about the PM Asha scheme, PM Asha scheme, that how this PM Asha scheme, this has been designed to ensure MSP through various different supports, has been kind of sidelined, which also reflects the influence of maybe political considerations over agricultural policies. So that's why there are all these aspects also being argued here, and guaranteeing MSPs could also increase farmers' share in the consumer prices, and that also can reduce the intermediaries' profits. Now this is where government intervention, especially legal MSP, can face a lot of opposition from the proponents of free market principles, because this is where a lot of intermediaries will start gaining lesser and the farmers will start getting more. And this is what the government has to ensure, and this is what the government also wants to ensure, that there should be a bigger share for the farmers, because they are the ones producing, they are the ones which become the lifeline for all the food production. So that's why the bigger share of profit needs to go to them. But due to the entire mechanism that has been built around agricultural produce, we see that farmers do not gain a lot. Instead, the market and the median intermediaries, they start gaining a lot more. So that's why this is also something that has been argued in the article, that these are the efforts that perhaps should be made so that the farmers can start gaining better. Now, overall, when we talk about that, so that's why all these things have been mentioned, that there can be legal measures that can help in all these things, and also can get various aspects of the international frameworks also, and overall we can ensure food security and address the market failures in agricultural sector. And then the problem that lies right now with regard to the adherence to the free market principles, and that is also we see that something that hinders the MSP aspect of, if we want a legally binding MSP altogether. So there are all these things, and we have to understand how exactly we have to ensure that how an equitable distribution can be done. Now there are certain counter arguments to this as well, which has not been mentioned in the article. So as one side of the arguments have been made in the article, there are other parts of the discussions also that often happen. So for example, if at all, let's say you are interested, there is one YouTube video, if you can go to YouTube, and there is one interview that was done by Karan Thapar with Dr. Ashok Gulati, who is an agriculturalist, an agricultural scientist, and this was done on the YouTube channel of The Wire. Although The Wire is known for being critical against the government, but this was one such interview where Dr. Ashok Gulati has brought in all the things that go against what are being what is being demanded by the farmers. So that's why we should understand that there are two sides of the story, and the entire aspect of MSP is way beyond some positives and some negatives that many people are trying to bring in. So we have to understand that overall, when you are looking at these issues, don't look at these issues from the perspective of a political discourse, that you might support one side or the other, and all your views then start to develop on the basis of which side you support. That if you are on the side of, let's say, one party or one political system, then in that case you are going to have all those arguments, something that is sitting with all the arguments being made by this political side. And if you are on the other political side, then you start making all the arguments based on what the other political side is making. So the issues actually become way more complex than just what one side chooses to support. And that's why this is where you have to understand that, because you are aspirants who are going to become civil servants tomorrow, for you to understand the complexity of the issues and all the sides of the argument is very, very crucial. So don't adhere to one side of the story, whether positive or negative, whether for or against. Don't adhere to one side of the story. Think of the country, think of India, because you are going to work for India and you're going to work for the Indian society once you become a civil servant. So that's why you have to understand that there are two sides of the story, and you have to ensure that you understand both sides of the story. So that's why one side of the story where we see a lot of support for MSPs and a legally binding MSP. On the other hand, there are arguments against it. So for example, some argue that there could be a market distortion, that some of the critics argue that legally mandating MSP could lead to market distortions by maybe artificially inflating the prices above the market forces and market prices, and that this is something that could potentially discourage the efficiency and the innovation in agricultural sector, and probably leading to surplus production of MSP covered crops at the expense of some of the other crops that might be in higher demand. So that is one aspect that has been argued. Similarly, it also talks about the fiscal burden, that implementing a legally guaranteed MSP could also significantly increase the fiscal burden on the government due to all the costs that are associated with the procurement or storage or maybe the disposal of the surplus produce. So, and that's why there are various figures also which are being put by some of the critics, and these figures vary a lot in their numbers, but so that's why it's very difficult to exactly come down to what exactly the number could be in this fiscal burden. Similarly, there are also chances of inequitable benefits according to many, that there's a concern that MSP primarily might benefit larger farmers in certain regions, and particularly only those who grow staple grains like wheat and paddy, while at the same time small and marginal farmers who constitute the majority of farming population in the country, they very often can remain outside the scope of MSP system due to the lack of access to all the procurement facilities that are being provided. So, and then at the same time, we also say that there is encouragement of unsustainable practices. Some also argue that by guaranteeing these prices, it could lead to unsustainable agricultural practices. For example, water intensive crops may be something which is unsustainable for certain areas, and that's why leading to environmental degradation and also unsustainable water usage in these kind of areas. And that's why the critics also argue that there is a need to promote the crop diversification and sustainable agricultural practices as well, to start mixing up with all these practices. And then lastly, the dependency on the government intervention, that relying always on government intervention through MSP is also seen as something that can create discrepancy altogether, and it can deter the farmers from being responsible to the market signals and adopting to the changing consumer preferences or the practices altogether in agriculture. And that's why maybe agricultural sector's ability to innovate and improve the productivity might also start to decrease. So that's why this is also something which is argued by a lot of critics in this particular area. So that's why there are both the sides, and that's why I said that the entire story of MSP becomes way more complex instead of just looking at one side of a positives or one side of the negatives of this aspect. Now coming to the next article, this is on page number 20, the science page. Changing cancer nomenclature can improve treatment outcomes. Now what exactly are we saying here? Now the article basically talks about certain scientists where the scientists have asked for revamping of the classification that we see in case of cancer and focusing on molecular characteristics rather than the tissue of origin. So what exactly has been proposed is a new classification system altogether, and that is where we see that it might help in better understanding of cancer altogether and better treatment practices as well. And overall we have seen that there is a limitation in the traditional approach according to the article, that traditionally cancer treatment and classifications have been based on the organ of origin for this cancer, and that's why we see that this is something that can also overlook the importance of metastasis in the and systematic treatments in all this scenario. So overall we need to understand that how exactly things have to change, because there are technological advancements that enable the identification of certain genetic mutation which are responsible for cancers, and this is something that can help in better drug treatments as well. Now when it comes to this kind of a development, this supports the need for a classification which is based on molecular and genetic classification instead of organ based classification. So that's why according to the researchers there are benefits of the new classification, that the new classification system, for example, it can reduce the clinical durations by focusing on the genetic mutations rather than the organ of origin in this particular regard. And that's why it also helps the patients to understand their treatment rationale in a much better manner. So overall, that's why there are all these things being raised and talked about, that how exactly it can help. That when it comes to the traditional practices or the traditional classification, it has also led to a lot of problems. For example, there has been delays in the drug access altogether. So because one by one, sequentially, we have been going with the testing, that one kind of cancer has been tested first, and then the second kind of cancer, and then the third kind of cancer. So that also has led to certain problems. And then we have seen that there are certain regulatory changes now that are being brought in, so that these things can happen faster. That overall we see that there is a shift towards the proposal that we see for the change in the classification system altogether. And that is where we probably see that new system changes are required, in systematic changes are required in cases of medical education as well, where we can understand better and we can teach people better with regard to all the things where we look at the challenges and hurdles of the current. So overall, we see that right now there are issues. For example, the accessibility to the genetic testing is one of the major problems altogether, especially in countries, let's say like our country, like India, where we see that when it comes to the cost of these tests, the cost of these tests becomes impossible for many of the patients. That the traditional tests that we have, as has been listed in the article as well, it costs somewhere around 7,000 rupees to maybe up to 30-40,000 rupees. But these new tests, they can be very costly, and that's why for a lot of people it will not be affordable at all. And that's why there is concern about generalizing these trial results also across all concerns without sufficient data available in all these specific types. So that's why, despite the potential that we see, despite all the obstacles that we see that this new classification can generally improve the drug accessibility and the treatment personalization altogether. Now understand the aspect of some of the things that are being discussed in this article from the perspective of cancer. Now when we say cancer, what is the meaning of cancer? Cancer in simple terms is nothing but the uncontrolled growth and development of cells. Alright, this is what? This is uncontrolled growth and development of cells in our body. So uncontrolled or abnormal growth and development of cells in the body. So normally what happens? Normally our cells would grow, they would develop, they would specialize, and then they would die, and as they die they would be replaced with new cells. And this is a continuous process in the body that keeps on happening every second. Just to give you an example, by the time I finish one sentence, 10 lakh cells in my body would have been replaced. So this is the normal way of working for the cells. But when it comes to cancer, in cases of cancer, what happens is that now there will be abnormal cells, and these abnormal cells, they start to multiply. They start to grow, and ultimately there are two things that can happen. Either they remain localized, alright? Either they remain localized, or they might start to spread. So when they remain localized, they are called as benign cancer or benign tumor. When they start to spread, then they are called as malignant. They are called as malignant. So now if it remains benign, it is still easy to treat. But when it becomes malignant, malignant means that it spreads. It spreads to all the other nearby tissues and cells as well. So it will not remain localized to just one cell or one tissue, but rather it will start growing to other tissues and other cells nearby as well. And this is where all the problem lies with cancer, because then treatment becomes very difficult. Then containing it becomes very, very difficult. And that's why then cancer in these cases can also become fatal. But are all the cancers fatal? The answer is no. If you look at the data, you'll find that more than 60% of the cancer cases are treatable today. And if they have been found early, if there is an early detection, in most of the cases, they are completely treatable. So that's why we do see that there are treatments available today. There are various efforts that are being made to understand this better. And when you understand cancer and the various different types of cancer, in total there are more than 100 types of cancer, and they are all based on where exactly they start from and what are the parts of the body where they are related to. Now this is where this is the traditional way of classification. When the article says that the traditional way of classification talks about organs, talks about the tissues where cancer originates, instead we have to look into the molecular and the genetic side of cancer classification, is what has been argued in this article according to the scientists and what they have found. So there are different types of cancer. Just to give you a brief about some of the major types of cancer, we have carcinomas. Now in carcinomas we see that they arise from the epithelial cells that cover the internal and the external body surfaces. So now in these kind of cases, when it comes to carcinomas, lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer, all these are examples of carcinomas. Alright, so that's why these all cancers that are common cancers, these basically, these are all carcinomas. Similarly, after that there is something called as sarcomas. Now these sarcomas, basically these are cancers that originate in the supportive and the connective tissues in the body. Let's say for example bones or cartilages, fats, muscles, blood vessels, etc. So that's why they basically they will be called as sarcomas. So for example, let's say liposarcomas. So liposarcomas are the ones that will happen in the fat tissues. So lipo or lipo, you can say liposarcomas. So they would happen in the fat tissues. Similarly, there is leukemia. Now when it comes to leukemia, leukemia is something that begins in the blood forming tissues of the bone marrow, and this is where it leads to production of large number of abnormal blood cells. Now overall, these abnormal cells, they can actually enter the bloodstream, and that's why when it comes to their examples, we see that there are acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and these kind of these basically they become very difficult to contain because they would spread very easily via blood streams. So that's why they become very crucial. So acute lymphoblastic leukemia, so they are the ones which can become very dangerous. Then there are lymphomas. So lymphomas are the cancers that originate in the lymphatic system, which becomes a part of our immune system. So they will be called as lymphomas. Similarly, there are melanomas. Now in case of melanomas, we see that these are the cancers that begin in the cells that make the pigment in the skin. And when it comes to these melanomas, they basically, because they are related to the skin pigments, we see that they actually are most commonly associated with skin cancer altogether. So that's why this is something that can lead to the common cases of skin cancer. Similarly, there are cancers related to the brain and the spinal cord tumors as well. These are named on the basis of the type of cell that they are formed and where exactly they first would have formed, on the basis of where exactly did they appear in our nervous system. So then depending on that, there are different types of cancers. And then there are germ cell tissues as well, or sorry, germ cell tumors as well. And these are the ones which actually are originating in the reproductive cells like the sperm cells or the egg cells, and that's why they can happen in the testicles, ovaries, etc. And that's why ovarian cancer or testicular cancer, etc., they are examples of germ cell tumors. And then after that, there are multiple myeloma and myeloma, and in this case the cancers, it might begin in the plasma cells, which you know as a kind of white blood cells in the bone marrow. And this is where we see that there are different aspects of it also can become very dangerous, and it will originate in the bone marrow. So that's why these are all the different types of cancers, and very often they are in the news also in one context or in one way or the other. So just know about all these, and these are the traditional ways in which we are classifying. Now coming to the prelims related articles that we have today, the first article, a small update, rather I would say, 2023 was the hottest year on record, confirms WMO or World Meteorological Organization. Now, what the World Meteorological Organization has said is that 2023 has been confirmed as the world's hottest year on record, and there the global temperature rise has been observed, and the average near surface temperature in 2023 was 1.45 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial baseline, and margin of uncertainty being plus or minus 0.12 degrees Celsius. Now, what also has been reported is that this has been the warmest year, that the last decade has been the warmest decade on record until now. And when we look at some of the previous records, the joint warmest years have been 2016 and 20, where the temperatures of 1.29 and 1.27 degrees Celsius on an average above the pre-industrial levels have been observed. So overall, these are things that we know, and these are data that we often come across. So just look at this as an update on the data that we keep coming across altogether. Then there is this article on page number 12, and this is about Supreme Court, that Supreme Court directs states to give ration cards to 8 crore workers. Now, what exactly is this article about? The Supreme Court basically has criticized the delays that were impending in its 2023 April order to provide the ration cards to about 8 crore migrant workers, which have not been covered as a part of the National Food Security Act. Now, despite these are registered, these people are registered on the eShram portal. Despite that, we see that although eShram portal has a total of 28.6 crore registrants, with 20.63 already linked to the ration card data, we see that the bench that was led by Justice Hema Kohli, the bench mandated that the issuance of ration card has to be done to the remaining 8 crore migrants and the unorganized sector workers within the next 2 months. Now, overall, this directive actually has come in the response to the arguments that were made by certain advocates like Prashant Bhushan, and they were representing various activists, and in this particular case it was highlighted that probability that more than 10 crore workers might be excluded from the Food Security Act's benefits, as the current statistics are based on the 2011 census. So that's why even this report or this number difference that we see, probably the number difference is bigger than what has been projected, is what it was emphasized in this. So overall, that's why Supreme Court emphasized that it becomes the responsibility of the welfare state to swiftly include the migrant workers in the ration card system. So that is basically what has happened here. So from the prelims perspective, we are talking about the eShram portal, which is an initiative by the Government of India, which was aimed at creating a national database for the unorganized workers. And this is where we are talking about various types of unorganized workers, like for example the migrant workers, the platform workers, the street vendors, the workers related to the gig economy, the domestic workers, agricultural laborers. So all these are included, and that's why it was launched as a part of Ministry of Labour and Employment's efforts. And overall, we see that the main primary goal was to ensure social security schemes and to ensure that government initiatives of outreach exactly can also reach the unorganized sector workers. So this is basically what the eShram portal has been, and where we see that almost 20 crore workers have been registered. Then this article on page number 12 again, 27.6 million people engaged in forced labor in 2021 according to International Labour Organization. Now, in this article, again, some of the important points, if we look at, some of the important points are that first, we see that the forced labours actually is generating illegal profits of almost 36 billion annually, and overall we have seen that there has been a 37% increase since 2014 according to a report. And the rise that we have seen in the illegal profits is largely attributed to the people who have been forced into labor and higher exploitation profits. Now, when we look at the various regions, the report also comes around and talks about the various regions, and the study actually had involved the surveys among all the workers, including the Indians in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, And overall what it also says is that trafficking and criminals, they actually make more than $10,000 per victim, and up to $8,000 that was being made almost a decade ago. And now we see that they are actually making up to $10,000 per victim. So this is huge, and we are talking about illegal profits that are being made here. And overall, when we look at the regional distribution, we see that the highest is in Europe and Central Asia, and that has been followed by Asia and the Pacific, and then the Americas and Africa, and the Arab states. Now, overall, when it comes to the data, it also talks about the fact that 2/3 of the total illegal profits actually come from forced sexual exploitation. And overall, we see that it also, although it involves only 27% of the victims. So only 27% of the victims, they actually are contributing to, unfortunately, 73% of the illegal profits in this particular regard. And then beyond that, we see that it also comes from industrial sector, it also comes from services and agriculture, domestic work. So these are also where illegal profits are being made altogether in the world. So that's why this report has been highlighting that there have been more than 27.6 million people in forced labor on any given day in 2021, equating to 3.5 people per thousand in this world. And this is something which is something that needs to be taken care of by the world, and various policy makers have to also understand this particular scenario, because it also emphasizes that forced labor perpetuates poverty and exploitation and undermines human dignity beyond a point. And that is what the unfortunate state has been altogether in this regard. So here we are talking about the International Labour Organization, which basically now is an agency in United Nations. It was established back in 1919, and overall it was supposed to promote rights at work, encourage decent employment opportunities, enhance social protection, and strengthen dialogue in work related issues. So overall, that's why we have seen that they have actually played a very, very important role as a specialized agency of the UN, and they have very, very important structure where they try to bring together the representatives of various governments, employers, and the workers to jointly shape the policies and programs with regard to all the laborers. Now, another article is about food price deterring inflation's fall. Now, overall, what this article says is that although we see that inflation has been decreasing and there has been a significant reduction in the core inflation altogether, but due to recurring food price spikes, according to RBI officials altogether, we see that we see that there has been not a significant increase or significant, you can say, improvement that we have seen in these kind of data. And the decline in inflation has been attributed to decrease in the core inflation, but the short-lived increase in the food prices have prevented a faster approach to the inflation targets, the 4% target that we have. And overall, that's why when we look at the last 2 months data altogether, it indicates that there has been a very limited reduction. There has been a very limited reduction in the vegetable prices during winter, and overall we see that the cereal prices have remained very high, and at the same time the meat and the fish prices have been increasing. So overall, that's why this has led to a rise in the food prices. And although the food price rise has been offset by maybe some of the other aspects in the core inflation, so that's why there hasn't been significant impact on inflation of the food prices. And overall, it is also being argued that because there have been certain things that, for example, in March, cereal prices, particularly wheat, actually have fallen, and that's why pulses, although pulses have seen increase in their prices, and overall edible oil prices have also started to decrease. So overall, when we look at the various aspects, one is that wheat prices, they have dropped, right? Pulses prices, they have increased. Edible oil prices, they have been decreasing, and the tomato prices have dropped. But onion and potato prices, they have risen. So that's why we see that there are all these are basically staples, and all these are important parts of everybody's food in India. So that's why we see that there, because some are negative, some are positive, they are not letting the food prices drop significantly or the inflation targets reaching significantly. And overall, because the fuel prices are expected to decrease in March, we probably will see a favorable inflation outlook in the coming days as well. So that is basically what we are discussing here, that despite a positive shift in the headline inflation's momentum in February, we see that there are some issues that are leading to inflation targets not being reached faster. Now we look at some of the revisited articles. Now these are articles that we already have discussed in a lot of different discussions that we have done, and constantly we have been discussing. So there are certain updates that we have, and this is what we'll discuss in these articles that we have right here. So the first one is about Supreme Court to hear pleas seeking stay on CA on April 9. Now the Supreme Court basically has agreed to consider the stay on the operations of the rules under the CA that is shortly going to happen before the first phase of the election that is supposed to happen in April. And the government that was represented by the Solicitor General Tushar Mehta, he declined to commit to not fast tracking citizenship for all the migrants, all the non-Muslim migrants coming from Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan. And although the case right now will remain pending as it is. So overall, this is what has been done. There was a three-judge bench which was led by the Chief Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, and this addressed all the concerns that were raised, and there have been a total of 237 petitions. You might know about this, that there have been a total of 237 petitioners about the potential implementation of the CA rules during the case's pendency. And that's why it was reassured by the courts that although that they would take care of everything, that indicating that government has a lack of infrastructure right now to even implement the CA rules immediately. So petitioners were also concerned about the fact that the government has been acting on the CA rules before the court's decision. So that is where court also reassured them that they could raise the issue if that happened at all. So until then, they need not worry about it. So we see that there were all these things and that were discussed. So overall, now there is the next date, April 9. This is the date that has been given by the Supreme Court to the government to come back with the reply to to these petitions. Then apart from that, there is this article, again something that has been in controversy for quite some time now. And overall, this is about Supreme Court issues summons to Ramdev in Patanjali misleading ads case. Now this case basically is about one issue that we see where there was a ruling by the court where the court had asked the company not to publish some of its articles in the print or digital media. But even after court's ruling, the company kept on doing it, kept on going forward with their advertisements, where in some of the cases they have argued that they would provide permanent relief to some of the diseases. And this is where it has come in the context of violation of Drugs and Magic Remedies Act of 1954. So this is what the government has said. And in this particular regard, when it comes to this, we have seen that this is where the Supreme Court actually demanded that Baba Ramdev should come personally and appear for the contempt case against Patanjali Ayurved due to all the misleading acts that are breaching the Drugs and Magic Remedies Act of 1954. Now overall in this regard, we see that the bench that had Justice Hima Kohli and Asauddin Amanullah, they basically issued a show cause notice to Baba Ramdev, and he has been asked for his response in this particular contempt proceedings. And apart from that, we see that Acharya Balakrishna also has been ordered to appear in the court on the 2nd of April after failing to respond to the previous show cause notice that was given by the court on February 27th. So overall, this is basically what is happening here, and we'll see how the things go on. And again, April 2nd is the date next. Then page number 13, we have this article, Israel may be using starvation as a weapon of war, is what UN has said. Now, in this regard, what the UN has said is that Israel basically has put severe restrictions on the aid on the war-ravaged Gaza, coupled with its military offensive that could amount to using starvation as a weapon of war. And this is something that, according to UN, it amounts to war crimes. It amounts to war crimes, and that's why we see that in this particular regard, this is something that was discussed by uh, the UN. And when it comes to this article also becomes important update on what has been happening, that beyond the war, beyond the fight that we see between these two regions, there are these aspects also that need to be highlighted. And that's why it was highlighted by the UN that there are severe restrictions that are being put on the aid into Gaza. And apart from that, the military offensive that is happening, it all amounts to a kind of a weapon of war, and that's why it amounts to a war crime. And overall, what we see is that it was also UN also denounced the rampant hunger and the looming famine that we probably see in Gaza, and attributed this to Israel's restrictions that has happened on the humanitarian aid and the commencing and the commercial goods that are displacing the population, and at the same time also leading to destruction of civilian infrastructure. And at the same time, it was also stated that the situation could be considered as using starvation as a method of war, because it was declared here in a manner. It was also something that basically we see that the there has been a lot of issues in the matter, and we have seen that ultimately the International Court of Justice has to decide on these kind of matters. So overall, we have seen that there was an assessment that was done. There was a UN backed food assessment that was done, and it also warned of imminent famine in Gaza, where what it is saying that half of Gazans, around 1.1 million people, could be experiencing catastrophic hunger. And it also predicted famine by the month of May for more than 3 lakh people in Gaza's four battered northern regions. So that's why we see that there are all these issues that are being raised all together in the context of Israel-Gaza issue or Palestine issue. Then page number 14, related to Indian economy, there is another article, and this is Norway will invest almost half of 100 billion under EFTA. Now again, EFTA is something that has been in discussion for quite some time now, and in this regard we see that there is supposed to be an investment of more than 100 billion as a part of India's signature that we saw with the EFTA. Now in this particular scenario, when we look at this four nation trade or the four nation EFTA that we have, India's trade with this, we see that there are two countries that become very crucial. First is Switzerland. Switzerland is expected to contribute more than half of the 100 billion from the free trade pact that has been signed between India and EFTA. And at the same time, this article highlights Norway's role as well, that the rest of the contribution will mainly come from Norway, apart from the other two countries. So that's why the trade pact which was signed between India and EFTA becomes very, very crucial in this regard, and this happened on 10th of March, and it aims to attract $100 billion of investment and create more than 1 million jobs in the next 15 years in exchange for tariff concessions in the sectors related to pharmaceuticals and chemicals and minerals, etc. in India. So overall, this is basically what we have seen, that there has been a high interest in India among the Norwegian countries as well, where we have seen that more than 130 of such countries, their companies, they are already operating in India. And especially in two of the cities, in Mumbai and Bengaluru, we see that many of these companies already are present. So that's why we see that it might bring in new Norwegian investments also into India. And at the same time, bilateral interactions between India and Norway also has been ongoing, and this is also something that can be very crucial for India's economic perspective into the future. So that is basically where we are looking at this EFTA and how this EFTA is going to be important, because diverse businesses like fisheries, agriculture, maritime, blue economy, energy transition economies. In all these cases, these countries can help. For example, we already see that countries like Norway or Denmark, etc., they have been helping us in building some of the alternatives. For example, in geothermal energy projects or in some of the wind energy projects, offshore wind energy projects, we have seen that these kind of countries, they already have been helping India. So that is the context in this particular article. Now lastly, coming to the questions, the mains questions for today. First question, critically analyze the proposal to classify cancers based on their molecular and genetic characteristics rather than the tissue of origin. Discuss the potential benefits and challenges of implementing such a system, especially in the context of developing countries. So here we have two parts of the question, where we are talking about first the proposal, that what are the aspects of proposal. So you have to talk about the positives and the negatives, and we discussed about the positives and negatives in the context of the article. So that is what you have to do. And specifically in the context of developing countries like India, we also discussed that there are certain issues that we will face as a part of this entire thing, and especially for countries like India, it may not be as easy to shift from the older traditional ways to the newer ways of classification. And then discuss the significance of projects like Gelefu, Mindful City and hydropower cooperation in shaping the economic and environmental landscape of India-Bhutan relations. So here again we'll talk about also the history of the friendship and how there has been a cooperation between India and Bhutan in many of these aspects of energy, of infrastructure, of economic growth, and also the cultural ties that we see between India and Bhutan. So these are all these things that you can write, and how it will not only economically benefit Bhutan, but also how it benefits India and at least the nearby areas which are the neighboring areas of Bhutan in India. So these are the things that you can write in this particular article or this answer. So this brings us to the end of today's discussion. Thank you very much for being here.